Welcome to this Group of 78 annual policy conference on adaptation, building resilience in the climate emergency. We were originally supposed to open with some welcoming remarks from Verna McGregor, who is an elder from the Algonquin Anishinaabe. Unfortunately, unforeseen events occurred which have prevented Verna from joining us on this occasion, for which she expresses her regrets. However, she wishes best wishes for our conference. This conference is being webcast from the traditional unceded and unsurrendered territory.
Oh dear.
Oh my. Okay. Okay, I'll just finish his sentence then. Algonquin Anishinaabe people, of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. And we must recognize that Indigenous communities have for many generations stewarded the rivers, coasts, forests, and land we inhabit today. We must learn from their example, respect their legacy, and express solidarity in their quest for justice. I'm sure we'll get Roy back fairly shortly. However, he would like to talk a bit about the history of the Group of 78 because this happens to be our 40th anniversary. So 40 years ago, 78 prominent Canadians issued a declaration to Pierre Elliott Trudeau, then Prime Minister of Canada, the statement that urged Canada to work for 1. Removal of the threat of nuclear war. 2. Mobilization of world resources to achieve a more equitable international order. And 3. Strengthening the United Nations and other global institutions designed to resolve conflicts, foster international cooperation, and protect basic human rights. The process of drafting this 1981 statement led to the birth of a new organization dedicated to discussing and advocating progressive foreign policies in Canada and in the international area. The organization named itself the Group of 78 in recognition of the trailblazing declaration. 12 of the 78 signing the 1981 statement are still with us. There are 3 participating in this conference: Tim Broadhead, Richard Harmston, and Peter Menke. Richard and Peter are both past chairs of the G78 and have worked hard for several months in the committee organizing the conference. That's the Climate Change and Environment Committee, which I chair. Tim is leading a recent initiative hosted by the Group of 78 called Climate Legacy, which focuses on mobilizing concerned seniors to get engaged in climate action. We thought it apt in celebrating this 40th anniversary to hear from one of the signatories who's not active in the G78, but is still very committed to the ideals and goals of the 1981 statement. Lois Wilson, or Lois Miriam Wilson, born Lois Freeman, April 8, 1927, became the first female moderator of the United Church of Canada from 1980 to 1982. It was in that capacity she signed the G78's 1981 declaration. A companion of the Order of Canada, she was the 1985 recipient of the Pearson Medal of Peace. She's also director of the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, which honored her in 2014 for her public engagement. In 1998, she was appointed to the Senate of Canada, serving as an independent until her retirement in 2002. Known for her skills as a mediator and for her diplomacy, she served as Canada's special envoy to the Sudan peace process, as well as the leader of delegations to China and North Korea. She's the author of 9 books, including I Want to Be in That Number, Cool Saints I Have Known, Clearly, Lois still has that fire in her belly. You can hear her evident passion to build a more peaceful, just, and sustainable world, a passion that was broadly shared by 77 other Canadians signing the 1981 statement, a passion that continues to animate the organization hosting this conference, the Group of 78. Finally, let me mention that to mark our 40th anniversary, inspired by the visionary 1981 declaration, we're reaching out to other CSOs to join us in calling for a thorough review of Canada's foreign policy, taking into account the emerging threats before the global community, not the least of which is the climate emergency. This week's federal election, which has resulted in another minority government, will hopefully give the public and CSOs some latitude to have a wild-ranging discussion to help forge a foreign policy that is commensurate with the realities of the 21st century. We are also reaching out to members and others who have participated in our events for guidance on the road ahead for the Group of 78. Can we go ahead, Sarah, with Lois's recording?
And the Group of 78 was brought together to look at the danger of nuclear war in the world. And we made some very strong statements on that, and I think had some influence on government policy. I think now, many years later, there are other issues of foreign policy that need to be addressed by the Group of 78. First of all, I'd like to say the Group of 78, the concept and the working model itself are very important because it gathered together people with expertise in various disciplines in Canada to work together on issues affecting our country's future. And I think that still stands, so that the Group of 78 is a very important, not really an NGO, but a collection of people who work together on these issues. While the issue of nuclear war still remains with us, it's on a bit of the back burner now, and the other issues have emerged. And I want to mention a couple of them. One, of course, is the issue of refugees in the world, and we're very much aware of it because of the situation in Afghanistan. Our refugee policy, one of the things I think we need to be aware of is the possibility and the probability of climate refugees arriving on our shores. People who have to leave their place of residence because of climate change, because of rising sea levels, because of torrents of rain, because of hurricanes, or because of fires or something of that nature. And that's on the horizon, certainly. In terms of climate change, I think I'd like to see the government a little more aggressive, quite a bit more aggressive in terms of its policies. Probably taxing fossil fuels and looking at fracking, stopping fracking, some of the things it can do that ordinary citizens cannot do. I think in the cities too, there should be money available so that we ramp up public transportation and take cars off the road. The time when everybody had their own little vehicles they could whip around is simply not feasible in the future. That means a change in lifestyle. That may be not be possible for governments to do, but one of the ways they get help is pricing gasoline so it becomes more costly to do that than public transport, and improving public transport so that it in fact is reliable and steady and people will make the switch. So I think that the major foreign policy thing ahead of us is climate change. We're well into it now, having had a summer of forest fires and hurricanes and droughts and all manner of things that were never part of the landscape before. And we need to address that, because if we don't survive, of course, then there will be no foreign policy possible. So thank you very much. I'm glad that the Group of 78 is survived and is flourishing. And I hope that you get more recruits who will work on these issues of foreign policy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lois. That's exactly what we needed to hear at this point. And thank you for your incredible work, your lifetime of work on these important issues. As we saw, Roy joined us very briefly, but he seems to have disappeared again. So I will continue with some of his... Oh, there he is.
Well, my profound apologies. We've had equipment failure taking place on an unimaginable scale. So for that, my apologies. But Susan, since you've started things off, why don't you continue, or would you like me to pick up at some point?
I think that if you started with your comments on why adaptation, that should you happen to disappear again, I'll pick them up and then continue on with the review of the program.
Okay, very well. So let me start by saying 3 years ago, the Group of 78 convened its annual policy conference on meeting the climate challenge, accelerating the transition to a post-carbon world. This focused on mitigation, in other words, attacking the climate crisis at its origins, identifying the sources of greenhouse gas emissions, and policies and actions to reduce or eliminate them. This year, we are focusing on adaptation, the neglected side of climate change. Adaptation is essentially about learning to live with and survive the deepening climate crisis. So why adaptation? Some might say, isn't mitigation a better use of our scarce resources and limited time to attack the root causes, to stop the warming that's fueling the fires, rather than to be distracted in a futile attempt to put out the fires? Simple answer is that the climate catastrophe is upon us now. It is everywhere, in the Arctic and Antarctic, in the temperate zones, in the tropics, in the high peaks and low plains, in the world's remaining forests. This year, as Lois has just pointed out in her video clip, we've witnessed the record-breaking heat wave scorching Western Canada, which killed 500 people from heat-related causes in British Columbia alone. We've witnessed the raging wildfires that fill the air with smoke from coast to coast. And across the Atlantic, record-setting rains caused widespread flooding in Europe with at least 229 deaths. Scientists tell us that these extreme weather events are driven by the warming climate. But even if we miraculously succeeded in shutting down all greenhouse gas emissions today, climate-driven weather disasters are here to stay for decades to come. We have reached a point where we have no option but to try to prevent catastrophe, to shield our societies from further devastation, to anticipate and respond to extreme weather events as dire civil emergencies. But adaptation, and let me emphasize this, does not mean giving up. It does not mean throwing in the towel on fighting the sources of climate change through mitigation. As the managing director of the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva, has put it, adaptation is not a defeat, but a defense against what is already happening. Put otherwise, adaptation is not capitulation, but a counterattack to protect society and civilization. Building resilience, perhaps, is a better way of capturing what adaptation is all about. It speaks more clearly to the need to be proactive. And building resilience can be proactive in two ways. First of all, by acting to avoid or prevent weather disasters before they strike. And this can range from having better building standards or zoning, more effective flood control, better forest management, and so forth. And secondly, it can be more proactive by swiftly recovering from disasters by building back better infrastructure after disasters strike. Prevention and recovery are inversely related. The more effective we are in avoiding or preventing disaster, the less we will have to pay for recovering and rebuilding. Note that the Global Commission on Adaptation has claimed that building resilience makes consummate economic sense. The Commission calculated that every dollar invested in prevention would save on average $4 in recovery costs and yields other benefits as well. Many adaptation actions can be undertaken by households at little or no cost. However, other adaptation measures, for example, by moving buildings away from vulnerable locations or rebuilding flood control infrastructure, can be very expensive. How to fund adaptation investment will be one of the key questions facing this conference. Another key question is the very uneven distribution of the costs of adaptation across the world. Most greenhouse gases, by a long shot, have been emitted by the advanced economies, the rich countries, over the past 2 centuries. Meanwhile, the poorest countries, those least responsible for the climate crisis, are suffering some of its worst impacts. To illustrate with recent examples, the death toll this summer from Hurricane Ida across the United States was 109. Compare that with Cyclone Idai, it's ironic how similar the names are, which hit Southern Africa in 2019 with a death toll of over 1,000, or in other words, 10 times as high as the death toll of Hurricane Ida in the US. And that is likely an underestimate. In a more equitable world, poor countries would be able to sue the rich countries for trillions of dollars in climate-related damages. In the world we live in, this is unlikely to happen anytime soon. But there is at least a strong moral case for international financial transfer from rich countries to poor to help build their climate resilience. Summing up, there is now a compelling case for making adaptation the co-equal of mitigation and global climate policies. The question is no longer whether to adapt, but how to adapt. And happily, the government of Canada seems to now agree. It is developing an adaptation plan which will be watched very closely by those who are involved in today's conference. I'll now turn it over to our conference chair, Susan Tanner, to talk about the plan of the conference. How are we going to tackle some of these questions through our various panels? Susan.
Thank you so much, Roy. I'm afraid that in all the confusion this morning, you didn't get an adequate introduction as the chair of the group of 78. And I know everybody's bios will be on the site today, if they aren't already. But Roy has extensive experience of which he speaks, and I'm very glad to be working with him on this topic. The conference that we organized in on climate change itself was the beginning of the Climate Change and Environmental Working Group, which I chair, and this is considered, in our minds, a very important follow-up to that conference. I like to use the analogy of a Canadian analogy of a hockey team, where we need to have our forwards scoring our goals, but we couldn't win the game without our defense and our goalie. And so this time, we're looking more closely at the defense and the goalie and how those players can also contribute to the work of the forwards and how we reach our mitigation goals. So, the aim of this year's policy conference is to enhance the national and global dialogue on the role of adaptation. So as Roy says, we will be definitely talking to federal ministers and employees, but we will also be mobilizing our networks around the world in the development and the environmental communities, because having been involved in many of those conferences, international global conferences, I really think that the impact of NGOs is essential to the progress that we have made so far on these issues. There seems to be still a level of a denial, both of the need to mitigate and the need to adapt. And Stephen Colbert jokes that people have difficulty understanding the seriousness of climate change. They do not seem to be frightened by the prospect of tornadoes, hurricanes, melting ice caps, or sea level rise. But when a study came out threatening our sex lives, then people have started to pay attention. Well, the experts on this program have been paying attention, many of us for decades. The conference there is a rich base of research, which we will distill in the conference, and it will be built on previous studies such as the Council of Canadian Academies expert panel on climate change and the adaptation potential, and other initiatives such as the flagship report of the Global Commission on Adaptation. We have representation from municipal, provincial, and federal governments, as well as substance experts. We have chosen 4 sectors in particular to focus on as examples: infrastructure, agriculture, health, and finance, to explore in panels both the potential adaptational responses to mitigate the climate change aspects and the possible conflicts and ancillary benefits for greenhouse gas emissions, reductions of those emissions. As I'm sure all of you know who've ever tried to implement a change, sometimes the solutions that are recommended have also big downsides, and we will be discussing some of that as well and what our best actions might be. Like COVID, this action is a global action, and so far we rich countries do not look good in our efforts to help the poor countries. In the COVID case, of course, to gain access to vaccinations, and in our case, to gain access to funds for adaptation activities. Our goal is to provide a series of recommendations which will bring the various players together as a team to address our existential crisis. Participants will help to generate a report with clear conclusions and recommendations to be forwarded to political leaders and to be shared widely as a contribution to public discourse of this critical issue. The Group of 78 will continue to advocate to governments on these recommendations in the years ahead. Now, I'm sure you have all taken a look at the program, or you probably wouldn't be here. But I'd like to make just a few comments on the program because it has shifted a little bit in the course of life, medical emergencies, various other things that have happened. So we're starting this morning with a wonderful presentation by Jayati Ghosh, Global Adaptation Challenges, Reforms to the Global Economic Architecture. And Jayati is standing by just for me to finish my few words about the program. The panel on infrastructure adaptation will be the next event, so that's tomorrow after Jayati is done. And then there will not be anything on Saturday, as some of the old programs have indicated. Bob Ray was to speak, but his ambassadorial duties have interfered with that particular time. And so he will now be speaking on Wednesday, September 29th at 12 o'clock, right at noon, and on Canada's role in the global context. And so then you have the weekend off. And the next session will be on the panel on food adaptation, which will be on Monday afternoon at 1 o'clock. Then you've got our panel on health adaptation. And on Wednesday, there will be Bob Ray, and then the panel on communities fit for the future, municipal leadership, donut economics, and adapting to a changing climate. Now, this fits actually quite well with Bob Ray's presentation because the center of the donut economics model is the UN Sustainable Development Goals, i.e. the basic needs for people across the planet which have been agreed to by all the members of the United Nations. So it makes quite a very good focus for a new economic model, which really needs one. And that is fine. I think the rest of the panels look clear. But what might not be clear to you is that on Tuesday, October 5th, we have a wrap-up seminar. So over the weekend, that next weekend, we will be working very hard to give you a draft of conclusions and recommendations. And we encourage you to participate in finalizing and confirming those recommendations and conclusions that we will be using for our further advocacy activities. So, Roy, are you able to do your introduction?
Yes, indeed.
Yay! Okay. Hello.
Okay. Well, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker, Jayati Ghosh. Let me say the following about her. Jayati Ghosh has recently moved from the economics faculty at Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi, India, to the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Her research interests include globalization, international trade and finance, employment patterns, macroeconomic policy, gender issues, poverty, and inequality. All the big ones. She has authored and or edited a dozen books and around 200 scholarly articles. Recent books include India and the International Economy, published by Oxford University Press in 2015. Many of us know Jayati as the Executive Secretary of the International Development Economics Associates, IDEAS, which I strongly recommend to those who have not come across it as yet. IDEAS is an international network of heterodox development economists. Jayati has also consulted for several international organizations, including the ILO, UNDP, UNCTAD, and UN Women, and is a member of several international commissions. She also writes regularly for popular media like newspapers, journals, and blogs. I'd like to end this introduction by saying that many people have observed that climate policy and economic policy are inexorably connected. If we ever do reach zero net carbon, it will require profound shifts in the structure and the nature of the global economy, in what is produced and consumed and by whom, in international trade and finance, in the distribution of income and wealth. There will be far-reaching economic transition measures, which is why we wanted to invite a leading economist to launch our discussion at this conference on climate adaptation. Jayati, it's a great honor to have you speak as our first speaker at this conference.
Thank you so much, Roy, for that very generous introduction. And thank you also for the opening remarks, which I think highlighted some of those very important issues in global adaptation, and particularly the inequalities, the North-South inequalities that have actually got exacerbated in the recent past. I think I'm very honored to be here as part of this conference, because I think you have actually also gotten onto what is something that is inadequately considered as very, very important in the world today, and that's adaptation. And I think you've already highlighted, all of you have already highlighted how important adaptation is in the world we live in. We know that, especially in the developing countries, we already have climate refugees. We already have massive loss of livelihood, of habitation. We have rising sea levels. We have extreme climate events that are destroying cultivable area, that are damaging the environment in ways that make human habitations more difficult. And so it's already upon us. It's no longer something in the future. Yet we don't actually have adequate support to deal with the adaptation issues. So I'm going to be largely, shall we say, a bit depressing in most of my talk, but I do hope to end with some possibilities for what can be done. And I think many of them really are very, very feasible if only we had the political will. But let me emphasize that I have two broad arguments. One is something that I believe will not be so controversial. It's really about how many parts of the global international architecture today, the economic and financial architecture, really do not help developing countries in adaptation policies. If anything, they harm them. And I will explain why. But the second argument I have might be a little more controversial. It is that many of the mitigation policies that are currently being considered will also create massive environmental damage in the global south. and that these are inadequately taken into account when globally these big macro numbers about mitigation and reducing carbon emissions are put forward. So let me just begin by talking about the first set of issues. How does the current global architecture prevent adaptation? Well, I think the most important way it does this is by the fact that developing countries have little to no fiscal space. And we've seen this already during the COVID-19 pandemic, when there was a massive discrepancy in terms of the expansionary policies in the advanced economies compared to what was happening in the global south. Let me just give you some IMF numbers to get a grip on this. 85% of all the additional public spending that occurred between January 2020 and March 2021, 85% of it happened in only 10 countries, of which the only developing country is China. Okay, so when I talk about the developing world right now, I'm leaving China out of it. It's exceptional for many reasons, but so just imagine 55% of that additional public spending came from just the United States. And this is only till March. It's before the latest Biden stimulus package. So you can imagine how distorted this whole fiscal response has been. To give you another comparison, the advanced countries spent on average anywhere between $15,000 to $20,000 per capita. Additionally, the United States spent close to $30,000 per capita additionally. The low-income countries spent $2 per capita additionally. $2. So what's going on here? And it's essentially because the global architecture operates in many ways to inhibit more public spending by developing countries. And my concern is that as adaptation becomes more and more of an issue, as all of these extreme weather events also hit the global north, we will see more of the inward-looking policies that we've already seen during the pandemic, where everybody is not just gazing at their own navel, but is actually determined to, do whatever it takes to save themselves, regardless of what it does to the rest of the world. So just as we've had vaccine grab, we will have developed countries do everything, whatever it takes to spend on themselves for adaptation without regard for whether the rest of the world can manage at all. And at the same time, we have a highly financialized set of global capital markets. The integration of developing countries with capital markets really means that any attempt that they may make to raise public spending in a way that would increase deficits, even temporarily, is immediately met by credit rating downgrades, threats of capital flight, and actual capital flight. And we've seen this over and over again, even in the last 18 months in the developing world, which means that emerging markets are inherently cautious, and they often, if you like, self-censor their own spending capacities. But even the countries that would like to spend, many of them are weighed down by very large existing sovereign debt, which is, a lot of it is frankly unpayable. It's very interesting that the global financial architecture is much less considerate or willing to forgive or reduce or restructure sovereign debt than it is to reduce, restructure, and forgive private corporate debt. So we've had the advanced economies forgive lots of private debt. Much of this we don't even realize the extent to which it's happening because it's opaque. It's not always brought out into the public domain. We don't find the similar consideration for developing countries. At least 80 developing countries have spent more on debt service during the pandemic than they have spent on health. And this is actually not getting better, it's getting worse. It's not helped by the IMF interventions, despite the fact that the managing director, Kristalina Georgieva, and the chief economist, Gita Gopinath, have both come out about the importance of maintaining public spending and increasing spending on health. On the ground, IMF conditions remain the same. They are still forcing austerity on developing countries in the midst of major public health crisis and environmental catastrophes. They are still forcing cutbacks in spending that impact on employment and wages of public sector workers and reduce the ability of citizens to access basic public services. And then, of course, we have the lack of international tax solidarity. I'll come back to this point because, it's so easy to resolve this one. We are developing, the world as a whole, the estimates for the lost tax revenues because of multinationals shifting their profits around to low tax jurisdictions and rich people, what are called high net worth individuals, moving their money around to tax havens. The estimated losses are anywhere between 550 billion to 850 billion per year, depending on whose estimate you take, the OECD, the IMF, and others. This can be resolved, and I'll come back to how we can resolve it. But so far, the moves to get that minimum tax solidarity and cooperation across countries that we need to resolve this and just make the rich pay their due, pay what everybody else is paying, have proved unsuccessful, which means that the fiscal constraint is further exacerbated because developing countries can't raise the tax revenues they need. They can't run the deficits, and they have to pay out a large part of their spending in the form of sovereign debt payments. Then, of course, there is the whole, if you like, I hesitate to call it the trade architecture, but certainly the WTO has impacted this. The legal architecture that has driven intellectual property rights. We've seen this operate in the most obscene way in the case of vaccines that were developed with public funding, which were critically dependent on prior public research and have been privatized, and where large pharma companies have really been given monopolies that enable them to charge higher and higher prices, even from the same governments that subsidize the research for these vaccines over time. I don't know how many of you are aware that the latest round of vaccine purchases by advanced countries have involved significantly higher prices of all the major sellers, Moderna, Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, etc. And of course, this lack of technology transfer that we have seen for vaccines is just as great for other green technologies that are absolutely essential for both mitigation and adaptation. And it's not only that the technologies are sought to be controlled, monopolized, and charged very high rates for the use of, but it's also that when developing countries try to develop their own, then they face cases in the WTO. China and India have faced cases from the US and other developed countries when they try and subsidize solar technology, which is absolutely essential in the whole mitigation task. And then there are other trade patterns. I won't say policy so much, but there are trade patterns in which I regret to say Canada is a major culprit, which actively delocalize production. And we all know that local production is one of the important ways to achieve sustainability, particularly in agriculture. Canada has been actively engaged in preventing the discussion on localizing agriculture, going in for more sustainable agroecological cultivation techniques. It has actively prevented even that wording to get into discussions like the UN Food Systems Summit, which is underway today, starting today. So there are many ways in which the global architecture, actively assisted by the governments of some advanced countries, is actually inhibiting the possibilities of adaptation by the developing world. Now, I'm making a further and stronger statement, which I told you will be more controversial. So let me get on to that one. I'm arguing that it's not just the existing architecture and the way that it has played out, which has created a problem, but even some mitigation strategies, things that are seen as good definitionally, are operating to make things worse environmentally, and in some cases even with regard to the climate in developing countries, and that these are simply ignored or they are seen as necessary costs, if you like, the unavoidable damage associated with saving the planet. So what are these features? Well, a large part of what is seen, even I regret to say, in terms of meeting the Sustainable Development Goals, a large part of the way to finance this is seen in terms of what is the euphemism now, I believe, is blended finance. Okay, basically public-private partnerships in which the governments or the public sector shoulders the entire risks of the investment and the profits are taken by the private players. Now, what's the difficulty with blended finance? Essentially, they are forcing developing countries to subsidize what are often more expensive projects, because many of these projects are pushed onto them by vested interests that are also in control of many of the systems whereby greening occurs. And so we now find that many developing countries are saddled with rather expensive projects where they have to import the technology, where they have to pay very large amounts for the finance that they are able to access, and which ultimately lead to significant losses on the exchequer, which possibly would have been much better off if they had just been able to do the investment themselves, but they can't because of all of those restraints on public spending that I was telling you about. But there is another aspect to this. There's a lot. I'm currently based, as Roy mentioned, I'm currently based in the US. And I'm struck by how everybody is celebrating the electric car industry and a range of other things, which, solar power and so on, which are all very good. I'm all in favor of them. Also, certainly they are very important for moving away from fossil fuels. But I think those who are engaged in pushing these assume that all the parts and necessary minerals that are required to make these things just happen. They come. And how can they assume this? Because you import them. The advanced countries simply import them, and so it's all there. They ignore the massive environmental issues caused by lithium, for example, and other rare earth mining and other mining for various, minerals required for solar batteries, for solar power, for the lithium batteries that go into electric cars, etc. I don't want to bore you with details, but there are now many studies done also by geographers of the massive environmental impact of this, as developing countries are not just encouraged, but sometimes even forced to get into these deals whereby extractive industries enter and often rapaciously, without concern for the impact on local people, local environment, local nature, extract as much as possible of these essential items to go into the electric cars that people here then feel very, morally superior for using. And I think that's important. We have to be aware of the entire, if you like, the general equilibrium of what we are doing. We have to think of all the ramifications, the linkages of different things, and not see a particular thing in isolation. I think it's also worth mentioning the recycling industry. Again, I'm in a part of Massachusetts where everybody recycles and everybody is very proud of recycling, unaware of the fact that, the recycling in the US is really a sham. It's exported. Okay, there's a massive trade in waste. The US is the largest waste exporter, and it goes to developing countries to be sorted and recycled, because this is not just much more labor-intensive activity, it's also dangerous activity. And we now find many developing countries saddled with radioactive waste, electronic waste that is seeping into soils, poisoning the soil and the water, and creating all kinds of other environmental damage, while people here are celebrating the fact that they're all recycling. Similarly, I want to highlight water pollution. So much of current trade practices and even many of the greening practices are assuming endless water, which is peculiar in a way. You focus on one angle, the how many degrees of the climate, but you forget about another aspect of nature, which is essential for human life, which is water. And it's not only adverse climate events that affect water supply. Of course, there is desertification, there is massive heating that dries up rivers, all of that exists. But there is also the pollution of water sources and the overexploitation of water, some of which is occurring once again because of all the mitigation strategies that are celebrated in the North, because people are not looking at the wider ramifications of what is being done. And then, of course, there is the fact that agricultural practices in the developing world are still we are seeing the pushing of so-called green revolution technologies, relying on very heavily chemical inputs, which we know have medium-term damage to the soil and to agroecology, being actively pushed through, for example, the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa and a number of other things where, I'm sorry to say, Canada is also implicated in terms of the impact that it has on sustainable cultivation practices in the developing world. Okay, so that's the bad news. Now, what do we do? I mean, is it all gloom and doom? Can we get out of this? Is there anything that can be done? Absolutely. And in fact, I think, when you think of the things that can be done, it's extraordinary that there is so much low-hanging fruit. There's so much that could be done relatively easily. And yet it seems insuperable because the obstacles are political. And these political obstacles are largely because of the power of corporate lobbies. So it's really people against profits. And yet we somehow think that it's some insuperable, impossible thing to achieve, when instead we're really facing the destruction of the planet. So you would think it would be kind of obvious. I keep imagining a future, not perhaps too long in the future, where people from some distant planet will arrive on Earth and wonder how we all actively participated in our own destruction to such an extent. But let's just consider some of the more obvious things that could be done really very easily. We obviously need much more fiscal resources for the developing world for all the reasons that I've outlined. One easy way to do this is to create more global liquidity. So the special drawing rights created by the IMF, we just had an issue of $650 billion worth of it, 500 billion SDRs. And yes, that's a start. We need much, much more, but certainly that's a start. It's giving some relief to some developing countries which are extremely foreign exchange constrained at the moment. But we also know that because of the way these SDRs are allocated or distributed, 400 billion of them, dollars worth of them, will go to rich countries that don't need it. That's because that's their share of IMF quota. Okay, the US is not going to use SDRs. Germany is not going to use SDRs. Canada, I doubt, would use SDRs, etc., etc., etc. The point is that there are significant, even in this limited amount. I think we need 2 trillion, but let's forget that. Even this limited amount of SDRs, most of it is not going to be used. It's going to lie there as an accounting thing in the IMF. So we should really be recycling these unused SDRs. And there are many possible options. A global health fund that would immediately give COVAX enough money to buy the vaccines it needs to vaccinate the whole world. A global technology access fund where you could buy up patents if you don't want to suspend intellectual property rights. It looks like that's not going to happen in the WTO finally, at least in the foreseeable future. Buy up existing patents and distribute that knowledge where more production can occur. A global social protection fund. 70% of informal workers in developing countries are informal. They have no access to either legal or social protection, things that are taken for granted in the developed world. Let's think of some minimum basic social protection for that huge majority of the world. And most of all, in this current context, a global public investment fund, specifically to deal with climate adaptation and mitigation. I put adaptation first because that's urgent, as Roy has already mentioned. Now, these are all things, 400 billion is a reasonable amount of money to get these going. There is absolutely no demand for it. There's very little awareness of it. I'm in a very progressive economics department in Massachusetts. And yet I find even my colleagues are not aware of these issues and how this should be an active demand of people put to policymakers in their countries. Then tax cooperation, I already mentioned this. But let me just give you a quick example of how tax cooperation could work. We know that the big multinationals pay next to nothing in tax because they do what is called base erosion and profit shifting. That is, they shift their profits to low tax jurisdictions. And that's why so many global profits happen to be made in Ireland, which basically a lot of these are just offices with 2 or 3 accountants working in them. There's a wonderful thing in Europe called the double Dutch Irish sandwich, whereby, everybody declares that their profits are all made in Ireland, Apple, Amazon, Google, everybody. And then Ireland has a double taxation treaty with the Netherlands, with Holland. And so they can somehow swing it that they end up paying 0 tax. These are things that are relatively easy to resolve. It seems like, oh my God, what do we do? The reason this can happen is because all of these are treated as separate companies at arm's length, as it's called. That is to say, Apple France is different from Apple Italy, is different from Apple US, is different from Apple India, it's different from Apple Ireland. So they're all supposedly contracting with each other. Instead of that, let's just treat Apple as Apple, which is what the shareholders do. It's one company, right? For shareholding purposes. Let's treat Apple globally as one company. Let's every country say, well, this is my share of your global profits based on a formula of sales, employment, assets. And I will tax you my share of global profits at my tax rate. Now, obviously, the best thing to do then would be to have a minimum global tax rate. There is already, unfortunately, the minimum that the OECD settled on is 15%, which is too close to tax havens. I'm a member of an independent commission for the reform of international corporate taxation, which has argued that it should be 25%. But let's even say 21%, which is what the Biden administration originally suggested, Janet Yellen suggested originally. We could get a massive amount of revenues, which again would be disproportionately in the North, but it would mean a huge amount to countries in the developing South. It would massively add to their revenues. Similarly, if we want to make sure high net worth individuals can't just keep moving their money around to cheap jurisdictions, let's think of an international wealth register. That is, every country maintains a wealth register and you share that data. It's already started. The UK has one, Norway has one. Some other countries are actually going in for asset registers, which would allow people to know who has how much where and enable the extremely and obscenely rich to be taxed as they should be. Then, of course, TRIPS, the trade-related intellectual property rights. In fact, it's absurd to call them trade-related. Intellectual property rights broadly, which is enforced currently by the TRIPS agreement in the WTO. The actual agreement provides a number of flexibilities. It says you cannot allow monopolies. You're allowed to do compulsory licensing when a monopoly is developing, when a country is doing anti-competitive practices. I think it's evident that there are lots of companies behaving like monopolies, extracting too much, doing anti-competitive practices. Let's actually use those flexibilities. Let's the US, Canada, Europe, let them stop bringing cases against countries in the WTO who try and use the compulsory licenses. First of all, let's also say that companies that benefit from public resources, prior public research, massive subsidies for developing the R&D, those companies should be facing conditions that make them share their technology. They should only be allowed to reap these obscene profits maximum for a short time, 6 months, a year. And they should thereafter share the technologies. So force the transfer of technology on companies that have actually had the entire R&D more or less paid for. And finally, the point I made about the mitigation strategies harming environments in the global South. We really do have to factor this in to all of the apparently good things that are happening in the global North and consider the impact on nature, on people, on livelihoods, and on conditions of life and work in those countries. Provide compensation funds, provide rehabilitation, enable a better revival of nature and a more ecologically sustainable way of doing this kind of mining and extraction of essential rare earths and other resources. These, as I said, these seem like, oh my God, impossible because we are so stuck in this framework. I think it's a common phrase now. People are all saying it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. But I'm not even suggesting the end of capitalism. I'm suggesting a tweaking, really. It's really just a tweaking on a change in regulatory practices that enables more equity and more sustainability. The fact that these are often seen as impossible demands is an indication of how blinded we have become by the existing institutional constraints. And my fear is that the longer we remain blinded, the more we are going to be walking over that cliff like lemmings and falling into that terrible and unfathomable sea. So there is a way out if only we're willing to take it. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jayati. That is an excellent presentation. I think you've raised a number of points that many of us were not aware of. And I think in addition to being blinded, we also can't spell. I think the problem is the worship of gold in the world. And if there were only that extra L, you would be worshiping God or some kind of greater, I would like Mother Nature value than just the economic one. Roy?
I'd like to add Susan's thanks for your compelling presentation, Jayati. And before we turn over to our Q&A, just to remind our audience that the chat line is disabled, so that if you have a comment or question, please go into the Q&A and we will take them more or less in the order in which they come. If I may be permitted a question to lead off, one of the low-hanging fruits that you mentioned was about how to allocate FDR, either a new allocation or the existing allocation to developing countries, and perhaps to the various global funds that you suggested. Who could possibly be against such a sensible proposition? It doesn't come at any cost to anyone, as far as I can determine. So what's the answer?
That's such an interesting question, Roy, because, I think it's again a sign of the lack of imagination. I've been involved in a group that has actually been actively lobbying with the IMF about this recycling process. And the answers were met with, it can't be done. You can't just set up a global fund. There are too many institutional constraints. It will take too long. It can't happen. So the best thing to do is to put it in the IMF's Poverty and Growth Reduction. Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust. I don't know if you know that. That's supposed to be a sort of IMF's IDA, what they give to poor countries. Right. Once again, lending with conditionalities to low-income countries. In other words, the opposite of what we need. Mm-hmm. And then if you mention global public investment, they say, yeah, it's a good idea, but how can it happen now? And, actually, this is the kind of response we're met with.
Mm-hmm. It's astonishing. It really is. Yeah. Okay, just reading through the Q&A queue. Robin Collins has made a couple of comments for which I would express our thanks. I don't think he's raising any questions. There's a question from Tarek Absoulay. I hope I got the pronunciation right. Do you think there may be some changes in Canadian foreign policy with the new government putting in consideration the emerging global developments in the new U.S. administration? And do you think the new Canadian government will give more attention to Africa? I'm not sure that's an entirely fair question to ask Jayati, but
I think you're best placed to answer that yourself, Roy.
well, what I would say, Tarek, is that the Group of 78 has actually reached out to many civil society organizations as part of its 40th anniversary celebrations to start a process of dialogue and discussion, inspired, if you will, by the experience of the original 78 40 years ago, to look at Canadian and international policy and how it can be transformed to meet the challenges of the 21st century, because our current foreign policy framework is badly out of date. So that's how I might respond. And so please stay tuned to further developments among the Group of 78 and our peer group in the civil society community. Okay, going on to the next question. Irvin Waller asks, an interesting one. What message on adaptation would you deliver, Jayati, to the UN General Assembly this week? And would China agree with your message?
So I suppose if I'd had to do a one-liner message, it would be do no harm, or rather stop doing harm. And I think I've outlined the various ways in which harm is being done to even adaptation strategies. So that would be my first and most important message. Would China agree with that? Yes, I do believe so. I think, I'm speaking from a developing country perspective, coming from a country where everybody is terrified of China and, hates it and so on and so forth, hates the rise, is jealous. Coming from a country like that, if you look at the contribution made by China to mitigation, it is probably the largest in the world. Why? Because it is China that drove the reduction in solar power costs. Let's not kid ourselves about it. It's entirely massive Chinese investment in solar power that created the economies of scale, that brought down the cost of solar power to the point where it is now actually achievable to do at scale, even in countries like Africa, if you give Africa the financing required for it. So I think China has played an important role in mitigation. China is also working towards adaptation. China, as an exporter of rare earths, is aware of some of the environmental concerns. Not that they're particularly good at doing that, mind you. They are pretty awful to their own population when it comes to extraction and all that. But nonetheless, they are aware of some of those concerns, which frankly, policymakers in the North are not. But most of all, there's this whole thing about how China is encouraging coal-based investment and shame on them and so on. Yes, but who are the biggest funders of coal investments in the world today? Out of the top 10 funders, 8 are US-based finance companies, BlackRock and others. The other 2 are European finance companies. How come nobody is talking about that? How come nobody is saying we have to put in rules that prevent finance companies from funding coal-based stuff? Put in conditions or put in legal stuff that prevents them. Regulate their activities to direct their funding towards green investments. So I do believe that there are many blind spots in terms of how the North looks at this issue. There's a huge focus on production rather than consumption. The greenhouse gases, the fossil fuels, etc., everything is measured in terms of the production rather than the consumption. Whereas it's the consumption practices of the North that are driving production in the developing world, which are adding to all these problems. And then I think that the adaptation part, China is much worse affected by climate change than the US and Canada. I know you're all obsessed with your forest fires and they were terrible and they were shocking and everything. But hey, this kind of thing is much, much worse in China, in India, in large parts of the tropical areas of the developing world, and so on. So I think we have to recognize that, China is not the bad guy in all of this.
Thank you for that very honest and candid response. Didas thanks you for the excellent presentation and asks you about the COP26 approach. And the COP26 meeting is coming up very soon in November in Glasgow to tackling climate change. What are your thoughts?
I wish I could be more optimistic. We've had, let's be honest, we keep hoping against hope almost that these global gatherings will generate something. At the moment, it's not even rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. It is steering the Titanic towards the iceberg. So I don't know. G7 says, we're going to do all of this. First of all, it's trivial what they say they'll do, and then they don't do it. The IMF meetings announce that this is all terrible, and then they do nothing in terms of what needs to be done. So COP26, so far, I'm not hopeful. The UN Food System Summit, it's the first time ever the UN has had a food system summit. It was very important, very essential, because, food insecurity it's almost doubled during the pandemic, but also climate change is ravaging food production in many parts of the developing world. So it was a huge and important summit. It's turned into a celebration of corporate agriculture. So unfortunately, I wish I could be more optimistic. Maybe something will happen in the world before November, and things will happen. But right now, I regret to say I don't have expectations.
Okay, speaking of expectation, and given your recent move to the US, do you see any positive signs coming out of the Biden administration to deal with these issues? We were so relieved, of course, with the change that happened south of the border, but how would you rate the Biden administration on any of these issues?
Oh dear, this is a very tough question. Because, I mean, obviously it is infinitely better than what came before it, right? There's no question about that. I think for large parts of the developing world, though, the Biden administration has been a bit of a disappointment. I'm being frank, okay? I don't mean that it will not change. I'm hoping it will, and I'm hoping that there will be adequate domestic pressure to change it. But, okay, let's take vaccines. It took several months before they even agreed to drop the opposition to the TRIPS waiver. But they have not seriously been lobbying in WTO to abandon it. They have not even forced their own companies like Moderna, which is entirely dependent on the US government for its technology, to share its technology. And the mechanisms exist. There's WHO has a COVID-19 technology access pool where Moderna could have shared its technology. They have not done that. They have not even shared their vaccines. I mean, okay, there's a big noise. Oh, the Biden administration promises to share, I forget how many million, and that will bring the total up to 1 billion. When? Because at the moment they have shared a tiny fraction. And it's also curious and very opaque. There's a lot of talk about how they had 80 million AstraZeneca jabs in stock. You hear nothing about that now. Why? I suspect it's because they actually expired and had to be destroyed. So, there's a lot. I wish I could. I mean, I do believe that, there hasn't been much in terms of a major change in international policy. Not enough of a change from the Trump administration. I think the withdrawal from Afghanistan was necessary, was overdue. It was an unfair, unjust, and obscene war, for sure. But the manner of the withdrawal is so shocking because it suggests that we Americans don't give a damn about you, even if you were the ones saving our lives for the 20 years that we were here. We will leave, we will take our dogs with us, but we will not take all of you who were guarding our compounds and who will now be assassinated or imprisoned by the Taliban. I think that message, it's a very powerful message that has gone across the developing world. And I don't think they realize the implications of that. You talk about soft power. Boy, is this an attack on soft power. That they don't care about you. Don't trust them, because if you risk your life to help them, they're not going to be there for you when you need them. So I wish I could say that it was much better. I mean, it's definitely better than it was. There's no doubt about that. But
but that's not saying very much.
Well, it is saying a lot. Let me put it this way. I come from a country where a leader got a second term, and we know what that means in terms of the destruction of democracy, the destruction of everything in all institutions. So I think a second term for that guy would have been fatal.
Okay, we have a couple of other questions, and I have one if there are no more in the queue. Claire Adamson asks, could the IMF grant money for projects, for example, in agriculture, with only SDGs as conditions rather than old-fashioned austerity for which the IMF is rightly condemned?
So, the IMF doesn't give money for projects. The IMF's job is to give money to governments for balance of payments purposes. That's explicitly what it was set up for. The World Bank gives money for projects. And the World Bank also has a private investment arm, the International Financial Corporation, which gives money even to private investors for projects. So there's a division of labor there. But what I'm suggesting is not that so much as that there are all these SDRs, which is just an accounting unit. It's not real money. To make it into real money, the government that gets the SDR has to say, okay, I'm exchanging my SDR for money, and I will pay this 0.06% interest, which is like a joke. It's nothing, right? I'm suggesting that the government that gets that money then says, okay, I've got this, and I'm going to put this in this fund. And this fund will give for global public investment or for social protection or health or whatever. But the IMF itself can't do that. And let's face it, the way the IMF operates, I don't want to give the IMF more power to give money because they basically mess it up.
Okay, thank you. I suspect that the SDR issue is one which we will focus in on in our conclusions and recommendations to this conference.
Yeah, you see, even if individual countries do that, that's already something. If Canada just uses those SDRs, gives them to something, or even just give bilaterally to some countries, it's still much better use of it than just sitting on them.
Okay, a couple of more questions. The UN Secretary General asks Douglas Ghosh wants countries to adopt a social contract to lead to better equity in the world. Is there any appetite for this? And what can Canada do to advance this idea?
Is there any appetite for this right now? No. Let's be honest. Can there be appetite? Yes. And I really do strongly believe that if there's enough noise about this, if there's enough public mobilization, if it's made into a political issue, then yes, you will get some response. I mean, governments don't do things because they're good or, they're nice, or they do things because they're forced to. So I think it is up to citizens to create that political mobilization which forces the government to respond. So yes, I think the political appetite can exist with enough popular mobilization.
Okay. Lou Auerbach says, in terms of strategies for adaptation and mitigation, what country or countries would you suggest are most worthy of admiration and imitation? Are there any role models?
So the one I'm thinking of is not a popular one in North America, but it's Cuba. It is in the thick of climate change. It's battered on all sides. And when you think about it, they're facing sanctions. The US is actively encouraging so-called dissidents and creating turmoil and furor and etc. Yet, look at their agriculture. They have got the most sustainable agroecological cultivation practices now. They have an amazing health system. They have got their developing technologies for cancer, which are apparently way ahead of a lot of the advanced economies. They have now 2 vaccines, which are, if the WHO operates properly, are likely to get approval because they've got very, very high resistance rates to the virus. And they have been able to do all this in the teeth of the most extraordinary difficulties. But most of all, I would emphasize, they are forced to adapt. They have no choice. They are right in the thick of it. Hurricanes, cyclones, rising sea levels, you name it, they've got it. They are surviving through an extraordinary resilience, which I think really deserves much more study.
Thank you for that response. Irvin Waller weighs in again, and he asks, he thanks you for a wonderful presentation and asks you to list 2 or 3 top priorities for the global north that you would expect the global south to endorse that will advance the SDGs.
Okay. Number 1, recycling SDRs, that's low-hanging fruit, right? I mean, it really doesn't cost anybody anything. So number 1 would be that. Number 2, it's not SDGs so much, but I don't think people realize how the pandemic is still spreading havoc across the developing world. Now that in North America, 80% are vaccinated and everybody's settling back to the old, the pre-times and so on, they tend to forget how it's still disrupting lives, livelihoods, and economic activity in the South. So I would say vaccine equity, a people's vaccine, is number 2 on the thing. If you're only giving me 2 options, those would be my 2.
Okay, if I may ask a question, since we've come to the bottom of the queue. One thing you didn't bring up, Jayati, in your talk was the situation in India with the Indian farmers up in arms against the Indian government's policy of steamrolling them with new laws and new measures which would basically undermine their welfare and their livelihoods. Could you say a word about it? Because I think this issue is not widely understood in Canada.
Yes, I'm so happy you asked me that question, because, it's a very India-specific thing, but I do believe it has very important implications and lessons for the rest of the world. This is actually the largest farmers' movement in history, not just in India, across the world, because we have so many people and so many farmers. This is a farmers' movement that has spread across the country. Of course, it's localized in terms of the physical manifestation, because they're gathered around the borders of Delhi, these farmers, and have been really since September last year, so almost a year now, through thick and thin, through rain, through cold, through heat, through harvest seasons, etc. It's peaceful. It contains lots of women. It contains all kinds of farmers, large farmers, small farmers. It contains landless people, etc., fighting against yet another attempt at the complete corporate takeover of agriculture. Now, the specific context is this. In the teeth of the pandemic, when everything was suspended, Parliament, etc., the government introduced and rammed through a web session of Parliament, where they had muted all the opposition, actually, rammed through a set of 3 laws, these farm laws, which they said was designed to modernize agriculture. Now, I won't go into the details of those, but what farmers fear, and they correctly fear, is that what they would do is open up the floodgates for, number one, getting rid of a public procurement scheme that assures minimum support prices for basic food grain, and therefore for domestic food sovereignty and food security. Get rid of that public procurement scheme. Get rid of the market yards which are officially regulated, whereby at least the buyers and sellers come under some kinds of controls and restrictions. They cannot, offer a sweet deal in the beginning and then, screw you over in the following year. They would actually have to operate within certain minimum parameters, and that they would prevent the monopsonization, the control in terms of the purchase by a few large companies. Now, the backstory to this in India is, of course, that the 2 largest cronies of the Indian government, the Ambani Group and the Adani Group, are interested in entering agriculture. So that's the domestic backstory. But of course, they have to also open it up to multinationals as well, right, as part of the whole WTO thing. So it's really a corporate takeover of agriculture, which would deny farmers not only the right to minimum prices and basic support and so on, but also would make them lose the freedom to cultivate what they want, force them to get into very commercialized, heavily chemical practices that ultimately would destroy that area. And they are aware of all of these issues. And what I find fascinating, I went and interacted with several of them when I was there briefly. Many of them are not highly educated and they're literate and on all that, but they have sussed out so much better than, let's say, mainstream media or a lot of the official commentary. They have sussed out the essential issues so much better. And they can tell you exactly what these fears are. And what I think is very interesting is that despite having a very repressive authoritarian government, which is really, arresting people without due process and without cause, keeping them in prison for years on end. I have friends in prison, human rights lawyers, activists, professors in prison. Despite all of this very, very repressive tactics, they have not been able to get rid of this struggle. And the farmers are very determined. And in fact, as I said, the physical expression is local, but it's national. You talk to farmers pretty much anywhere in the country, and they are aware and conscious of this. So this is going to be a very interesting thing in terms of how it plays out. Not only the longevity and the size of the struggle, but really, can governments win out against people? And I'm hoping they can't. But it is definitely something that the rest of the world should be watching as well.
Thank you for that response. I should point out to our audience that one of our other keynote speakers, Rachel Besner-Kerr, is going to talk about agroecology as an alternative, as a viable and sustainable alternative to industrialized agriculture when she gives her keynote address next Thursday at 10 o'clock in the morning. So very much in the vein of what Jyoti was saying. Do you have time for a couple more of this?
Okay. I'm supposed to join another meeting, but another 5 minutes should be fine. Yeah.
Okay. Well, the first is a comment, perhaps, rather than a question. My son-in-law's mother in Cuba is only kept alive with antibiotics and credit cards sent from Canada, obscured by the massive propaganda of the communist dictatorship. I don't know if you wanted to comment on that.
Not really, no. I mean, what can I say?
All right, that's fine. Bruce Campbell finally asks, who do you see within the political leadership of the global north that would advance the restructuring of the global architecture? What countries give you the most hope in this regard?
In the global north?
In the global north, yeah.
Does New Zealand count as global north?
I would think, yes.
Okay, yeah. Jacinta Ardern, yay.
Okay, it's a very crisp answer to a good question. All right, so should I turn it over to you, Susan, for thank you and a wind-up of the session? You're muted.
Thank you. Jyati, I'm stunned at the implications of some of what you've said. I thought I knew a little bit about it, although I've been in environmental areas exclusively and not so much in international development. I do have some experience with Cuba, though. I know people who say that it has the best heart, way better than the United States heart system as well. So they have, but it was a very important, stimulating, the right way to start off our discussions. And I can't thank you more. I don't have enough words to thank you to the degree that you deserve thanking. And I'm so glad you took time out of your schedule. I know moving back and forth, India, the United States, whatever, it is fabulous what you've given us. And thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. And thank you for all of the questions. They were extremely interesting. Yeah.
Thank you. For the rest of the day, we don't have any Zoom items. And so we will see you, I hope, on tomorrow afternoon for the infrastructure panel, which starts at 1 o'clock, and you will find an invitation to it if you've registered in your email. So I hope everybody has a good day, even though in Ottawa it's rainy. I know some of you are somewhere else, but have a very good day and see you tomorrow. Thank you very much.